It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP David Johnston, Green Party MP Caroline Lucas, Guardian columnist Sonia Soda and Times sketch writer and author Quentin Letts. Today, should we worry about vaccine delays?
We are experiencing some supply issues, so it does mean that, that the vaccine rollout will be slightly slower than we might have hoped.
Will sending asylum seekers abroad deter migrants? We'll look at the replacement for the EU's Erasmus scheme for students.
Why is this Tory government taking opportunities away from our young people?
The Turing project is designed to help kids across the country of all income groups.
And this was a park in Liverpool yesterday. Is COVID compliance faltering? Let's start today's programme with reports suggesting the government is looking at sending asylum seekers to third countries to process their applications. The Daily Mail covers the story like this. Priti, as in Priti Patel, asylum seekers to be sent overseas. Exclusive radical plan for future Channel migrants. Just to start us off, David, it may be a radical plan. Is it compliant with human rights law?
Well, for the time being, this is a report about a consultation document that doesn't come out until next week. So I don't know the details of what will be in there. What I do know is that the government is very concerned about the people traffickers, people smugglers who prey on the vulnerable and take what cash they have to encourage them to make very dangerous crossings, sometimes across the channel, sometimes in the back of lorries, which can and does sometimes lead to those vulnerable people dying en route. And so as much as the government's looking at enforcement, it wants to make sure that we remove the incentive for those people trafficking gangs.
Right, and do you think that would be a way of doing it?
I think we've got to look at all options. We'll see what the government is considering when the document is published next week. But I think it's right that the government looks at all options to stop this awful practice.
Right. Caroline, should it be an option amongst others to try and deter those crossings?
No, I think it completely misunderstands what's driving people to make those crossings in the first place. I think this plan is inhumane. I think it'll be impractical. I think it'll be wildly expensive. The people smugglers, which is a terrible trade, but the people smugglers have a market for their trade because people have no other way of trying to claim asylum here in the UK. Because we make it such that they have to be on British soil in order to be able to claim asylum on British soil, that is what is driving the big risks that people are taking to try to make their way here to the UK. What we need are safe and legal routes. That means routes that people can apply from outside the UK or humanitarian visas. There's a whole range of ways we could do this. Priti Patel says she's exploring every possible avenue. It seems extraordinary to me that she wouldn't be pursuing the avenue that is reasonable, which is less costly, and that is the legal and safe routes.
Right. Quentin, this comes ahead of plans, as we understand, in the next week or so for overhauling the immigration system. Various places have been mentioned in the reports, perhaps Morocco or Papua New Guinea or Gibraltar or even the Isle of Man. Now, there is a familiarity to some of this. I remember it being discussed when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. David Davis, when I interviewed him many years ago as Shadow Home Secretary, also talked about it, and it never happens.
No, it never happens, and I don't think it's going to happen this time. And the Isle of Man has already come out there. Someone... a senior politician there said it must be early April Fool's Day. Gibraltar has said it's a non-runner. There's not much space in Gibraltar for anything, let alone a centre for placing such people. And I just think it's one of those stories that special advisors push out in the hope that it might buy them a bit of extra time. So I'm very sceptical about it.
Right. I mean, Sonia, Australia does have a scheme a little bit like the one that has been reported on. So it does actually happen.
It does happen, but that scheme has been incredibly criticised, including by the UN. There are lots of people that say that it isn't compliant with international law, as well as Australia's obligations, moral obligations to asylum seekers. And the Australian system has been plagued by terrible, terrible reports of human rights abuses. And I think that's the question for the government today. Asylum seekers, they are fleeing conflict, war-torn regions. They have a right to claim asylum when they reach a country, and to deport them to a country where there aren't good safeguards for their human rights would potentially be in conflict with human rights law. I think the other thing we really need to do is to put this in context, because I think this is the government sort of picking a culture war, almost using asylum seekers as pawns in it. And if you were to listen to the government, you would think we've got huge problems with massive increases in the number of asylum claims. That's just not happening. In fact, asylum claims have gone down in the last year. They're about half the level they were in the early 2000s. We have way, way fewer applications in countries like France and Germany. Our rate of application per citizen compared to the EU average is much lower.
All right, David, do you want a very quick response to that?
Yes, we've got a very proud record of taking asylum seekers and refugees. Between 2015 and 2019, we took 25,000, which was higher than anywhere else in Europe and the fourth highest rate in the world. And it is worth saying that a lot of these crossings are, of course, coming from France. So they're not coming directly from the place that the asylum seekers are fleeing. They're coming from France, and it's right that we deter people traffickers from preying on the vulnerable.
All right, and we're going to hear more details about what is being considered, as I said, in the next few weeks. Let's turn to the story about vaccine supply. The Times has this headline, which is setback for Britain's COVID vaccine rollout. Yesterday, a letter was sent by NHS England to local vaccination sites and centres. We're just showing our viewers that letter, and I'll just read a section from it, which is: there will be a significant reduction in weekly supply available from manufacturers beginning in the week commencing the 29th of March. Well, let's welcome Nick Triggle, who's the BBC's health correspondent, to talk about this. What's happened, Nick?
Well, it seems there's a couple of issues at play here. The UK vaccine supply comes from domestically. There's two plants that produce the AstraZeneca vaccine. The supplies of Pfizer comes from Belgium, and the UK government had also signed a contract to get 10 million doses from the Serum Institute in India. Now, the hope was that all 10 million doses would be arriving in March to give this bumper supply, but it now appears only half of that shipment has arrived. We understand the Indian government wanted to prioritise the doses for their own population. There's also some issues, we understand, with the other sources of vaccine getting through safety checks. I think about 1 million doses have been held up there. So it does mean this week we've got good supply, but later on, towards the end of March and into April, that supply will begin to drop. We've always been told the supply chains are fragile, and this is another reminder of how true that is.
Right. I mean, people might be alarmed to hear that and hear some of the detail. Will it affect the rollout of the vaccine?
Well, the government is adamant it won't. The target to offer all adults a first dose of the vaccine by the end of July will still be met. The over 50s are set to be complete by mid-April. In fact, they may well have got through all the over 50s before that. But there had been hope that the rollout could be done more quickly. There was suggestions at the weekend that they could do all adults by the end of June and soon be getting on to those people under the age of 50. But that is having to be just paused or slowed down. And that's because come April, there's significant numbers of second doses that need to be given, millions of people a week. And so until we get extra supplies in, they will not be able to offer it to the under 50s in significant numbers. Now, we are hopeful that Moderna, a third vaccine that's been approved for use in the UK, the first supplies of that may start arriving after Easter. And of course, the rest of the delivery from India should start arriving in 4 weeks' time. So it's a hiccup along the way, but the government is adamant it can still meet its targets.
Right, OK, so the government thinks its overall target can be met. Is there any risk, though, Nick, of increased transmission amongst younger age groups while they wait a little bit to get their vaccine?
Well, of course, the vaccines do help reduce transmission to some extent. So the quicker people get vaccinated, the better chance we have of keeping those infections low. But what's important is that the over 50s, who should all have been offered a vaccine perhaps by the end of this month, are the ones where 99% of deaths are in that age group. The majority of hospital admissions are in that age group. So in terms of that serious illness, it shouldn't have an impact on that, nor should it have an impact on the lifting of restrictions.
Nick, thank you very much for joining us. Let's just turn to the panel now. In fact, we're expecting Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, to make a statement in the next 5 minutes or so, and we'll bring you some of that when we can. It is a reminder, though, isn't it, as Nick was saying, David, that we're not in control of this pandemic and it is unpredictable.
Well, I think the government's always been clear that the supply of the vaccine would be the limiting factor in how quickly we could vaccinate people, given that the NHS, all our volunteers are all doing such a great job getting it into people as soon as it arrives. But it is worth just reflecting on the fact that yesterday we passed 25 million people having been vaccinated, which is half of all UK adults. So actually throughout this process, we've been ahead of schedule. And as Nick said, the government's very confident that we'll have done all the priority groups by the 15th of April and offered every adult a vaccine by the end of July.
Right. Caroline, do you think it is an indication of how fragile things still are in terms of having a sort of even rollout?
Well, we know that the manufacturing process for vaccines is very difficult, quite unpredictable in terms of a process in itself. And that's before you layer onto it the kind of layers of geopolitics, if you like. What worries me, in a sense, is partly the way that this information came out. It was very odd that Matt Hancock came bouncing out for his press briefing yesterday and didn't even mention it, which gave the kind of impression that something was being hidden, which I don't think was very helpful. But also, I hope it might stimulate a wider discussion about the global rollout of vaccines more generally, because it is deeply concerning that so many countries in the global south still don't have any access to vaccines at all. That although this COVAX mechanism exists, this mechanism whereby the richer countries are meant to be sharing with the poorer countries, it's becoming clear that that's not going to happen anytime soon in terms of vaccines actually reaching those countries. The UK, along with other countries, is blocking proposals at the World Trade Organization, which would have enabled some of those poorer countries to have had a greater access to the manufacturing process themselves. So there is an issue of global equity at the heart of this, as well as the back and forth that's happening now between the UK and EU.
Well, as you mentioned that, Caroline, let's move on to that subject of the EU. The Metro has headlined with Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, there on the front page, "We'll grab your jabs." Now, what Ursula von der Leyen said yesterday at a press conference is what we want is reciprocity and proportionality in exports of vaccines. We're ready to use whatever tools we need to deliver on that. This is about ensuring Europe gets its fair share. Now, she is talking in the main about the UK. This is how the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, responded.
Frankly, I'm surprised we're having this conversation. It is normally what the UK and the EU team up with to object when other countries with less democratic regimes than our own engage in that kind of brinkmanship.
Caroline, has he got a point there, Dominic Raab?
Well, I don't think that the EU has covered itself in glory, obviously, over the past few weeks. It's sitting on piles of the AstraZeneca vaccine because of safety concerns, which the World Health Organization has said are completely unfounded. But von der Leyen is right to say that the two-way street of vaccines isn't working, that 34 million vaccines, I think, made in the EU have been exported, 9 million of which have come to the UK, but no vaccines made in the UK have gone back to the EU. So I think she's got a point. The way she's put it isn't very helpful, and neither is the way that Dominic Raab responded to it. And that's why I think we need to take a step back and try to work out what is the basis going forward that is on solidarity, not just on competition.
Right. David, you were shaking your head.
Yeah, she doesn't have a point. There's been lots of bizarre statements coming from EU leaders during this period, but the reality is we should focus on what's happening with the rollout, and it's going very well. What's going on with the vaccine suppliers is they are fulfilling the contracts that they put in place with countries, and I would not expect the EU to interfere in those contracts. One other just important point, in addition to the one that Caroline just made about vaccines sitting in warehouses that are not being used, which I think your viewers might be interested in, is that we are also dramatically upscaling our own manufacturing capability. And in my own constituency in Harwell, we're going to have the Vaccine Centre, Manufacturing and Innovation Centre, where when that's ready in the summer, we'll be producing 70 million doses within a 6-month period here on this soil. And a lot of these problems, I think, will then disappear.
Sonia, what's your take on this row, really, between the EU and the UK?
Well, I think it's a massively unhelpful ratcheting up by Ursula von der Leyen. It really helps no one to sort of be issuing these threats across the English Channel. But I would agree with Caroline, actually, that I think we need to take a step back, because when we're having these sort of rows between ourselves as a sort of set of richer countries that have much better access to vaccines, we tend to sort of forget the fact that there are countries with no access at all. And you know, I would say absolutely it's a matter of solidarity. We should, you know, obviously we care about vaccinating our own population desperately, but we should also be thinking about equitable access for countries who are less rich than ourselves. But also there's some real self-interest here as well, which is that I think over the next 2 or 3 years, the risk that scientists are worried about is that we start to see variants develop that might be vaccine resistant. And the way to sort of ward against that globally is to make sure that there is as equitable a distribution of vaccines as possible to avoid new variants of COVID springing up that could actually, in 2 years, pose a massive challenge to us again that may be perhaps more difficult to develop vaccines from scratch for.
Right. I mean, Quentin, though, don't you have some sympathy for Ursula von der Leyen? I mean, if the roles were reversed, wouldn't the UK government be doing everything it possibly could to try and get vaccines for its population?
Yes, politicians behave quite badly too. So when Sonia said earlier that this wasn't helping anyone, von der Leyen's behaviour was not helping anyone, it's not quite true, because it's actually helping her. It's helping her with her own voters and her base. And so that's the reason she's being a bit unreasonable about this. I mean, at this point, a cartoonist might reach for the old cliche of Germans trying to run down to the beach and put their towels on the sunbeds before everyone else. And that's great, sort of glorified way, and a much more serious way. Of course, that's what's going on. Countries are trying to protect their own first, and that's perhaps only right and proper. That's the way that politics works. But I think the one upshot of all this, and if there is a bit of a delay, the boosterism got out of its pocket a bit too much perhaps, but if there is a delay in vaccinating the under 50s now, I think it's going to make it harder for politicians here to get away with imposing vaccine passports.
Ah, OK. Well, we're not going to go on to vaccine passports just at the moment, but just, Caroline, to respond to Quentin's point there about politicians just doing what they can to shore up their base.
Well, I hope that's not what this is about, because it could scarcely be a more important issue of life and death. And I come back to the point that we need to have an approach based on solidarity, and we need to be looking at the global access to vaccines, not just because that's the moral thing to do, but that is where actually our own self-interest lies as well. As Sonia said, if we're having variants that are more likely to happen in those areas that haven't had the vaccine and then come back to bite us, then that's solving nothing. So let's try to make sure that our politicians and my colleagues actually have a slightly longer term perspective and recognise that all of us are much safer when everybody is. And while there are still swathes of the world that aren't getting even anywhere near their first vaccine, they haven't had a vaccine at all, then I think that's making all of us less safe, and that's where self-interest should lie as well.
Quentin?
I think that's a bit idealistic. It's very noble, Caroline's saying, but it's a bit idealistic. People will always try to protect themselves first.
Come on, it saves us all. You know, how on earth are we going to make the UK more safe if there are whole swathes of the world that aren't?
I disagree.
Right. Well, I mean, Sonia, there may be some self-interest. Is that not natural for individual governments, whatever you have said, and Caroline too?
I think it's natural for governments to be short-termist about this. And I think, we've seen our own government be very short-termist, not necessarily about vaccines and vaccines rollout, but in terms of, the way it's approached, for example, the timing of lockdowns, it tends to leave it too late to impose them. And then that leads to much higher costs later down the line because of the nature of a virus that sort of spreads exponentially. So absolutely, it is the case that politicians tend to take too short-termist a view, even when it comes to our country's self-interest. But this is such, this is sort of the biggest kind of global threat that we've faced in terms of health terms for a very long time. So you've kind of got to hope that, and maybe it is a bit idealistic, but I think it's really important to put pressure on politicians to think about this from the long-term perspective as well. Right.
I mean, David, but that is the point, isn't it? There's no issue here at the moment. But if people aren't vaccinated in the EU, it will restrict lockdown being unwound on a greater scale.
Well, we need everybody to be vaccinated as quickly as possible, which is why the 14 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine that are sitting in warehouses in Europe ought to be used, because that vaccine is completely safe, and that will be confirmed again today. And then for the broader global effort on the vaccine, we do have the commitment to COVAX. I think 92 million. I think it supports 100 different countries with suppliers of the vaccine. So we absolutely recognise everybody needs this as quickly as possible, but naturally we want to protect our own citizens first.
All right, let's have a listen to Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, who's been addressing the issue of vaccine supply.
We have committed to targets on which it is vital to say that those targets to offer the vaccine to everyone aged 50 and over by the 15th of April and to all adults by the end of July. I can confirm that we are on track to meet both of these targets. I also want to clear up some rumours that have been circulating and give people reassurance. There will be no weeks in April with no first doses. There will be no cancelled appointments as a result of supply issues. Second doses will go ahead as planned.
Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary there in the Commons. And we can also let you know that Boris Johnson will be hosting a press conference, probably along similar lines of this issue later on today. We're going to play you a bit of Boris Johnson, though, from last December, and this is about the government's replacement scheme for Erasmus, the EU student exchange programme. It's called the Turing Scheme, and here's Boris Johnson talking about it.
So what we're doing is producing a UK scheme for students to go around the world, and it'll be called the Turing scheme, and it will so students will have the opportunity to named after Alan Turing. So the students will have the opportunity not just to go to European universities, but to go to the best universities in the world, because we want our young people to experience the immense intellectual stimulation of Europe, but also of the whole world.
Caroline, are you excited about this replacement scheme?
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but no, I'm not excited about it. I think it is, just yet another example of the UK burning bridges that it didn't need to burn. The Erasmus scheme was one of the most popular schemes amongst young people and the education establishment in the UK. Boris has sometimes tried to portray the Erasmus scheme as being in some way elitist, but it really wasn't. 1/5 of vocational placements went to disadvantaged students. There were plenty of vocational placements within Erasmus as well. And it was based on reciprocity. There was that sense that foreign students would come to the UK and you would have that real exchange of cultures and ideas. This is a one-way street. I think it's basically going to be a bargain basement version. It's going to not really be able to take the place of Erasmus that had been 30 years in the growing and had just been such a great thing. Why wouldn't we want our young people to really enjoy everything that the EU can bring, and for EU people to come to the UK and enjoy our culture? I think it's really disappointing that amongst everything else that the Boris Johnson has been doing on Brexit, this is yet another thing that he's messing up.
David?
Well, when we talk about our young people, we should be clear about who we mean, because I worked with thousands of disadvantaged young people before I came into politics, almost none of whom took part in Erasmus. Because if you look at the facts on Erasmus, every study that looks at who takes part in it shows that it's overwhelmingly the wealthiest families, not just here, but in Europe as well. One study found 2/3 of those who took part have at least one parent who's a professional and executive technician. Half have an income which is higher than average or considerably higher than average. This was not a scheme that was benefiting disadvantaged young people in the main. And the point of Turing, as well as to open up Britain to countries way beyond Europe, we can still go to Europe, but lots of other places too, it will specifically focus on getting more disadvantaged young people to take part in it.
Caroline?
Well, I disagree. And I think to the extent that there might have been a problem with access to Erasmus, then solve that problem. Don't try to create this other program, which there isn't going to be the same degree of finance to it, because, you know, if you're trying to promise placements, you know, at the other end of the world, that's going to cost an awful lot more for your disadvantaged students to be able to make the most of them than just getting to Europe, for example. So I think it's a lot of hot air and rhetoric, but actually, when you look at it, I don't think it's going to deliver what the government claims. And to the contrary, I think we're going to actually see a restriction of opportunities for younger people as a result of this.
David?
Well, the living cost amount that is going to be provided through Turing is higher than Erasmus. The travel support that's going to be provided is higher than Erasmus. And Erasmus was an incredibly expensive scheme where we were projected, had we taken part for the next 5 or so years, to put in £2 billion more to it than we got out, because it's a lot more popular for European students to come here than it is for UK students to go to European countries, because they're often more interested in going to America or Canada or India or Australia.
Caroline?
I mean, we're just going to disagree on this. I think all that I've seen suggests that actually the amount of finance that's going to help people to get to the other end of the world through Turing is far less than was available to people to pursue the Erasmus options. I think that one of the reasons that Boris Johnson, you know, replaced Erasmus was because he said it was going to be too expensive. So I don't think David can have it both ways.
Right. I mean, Quentin, do you think this is about the EU versus global Britain? They both have their benefits, this scheme, as it sounds.
I think there's a bit of Brexit continuity battling going on here. I think Erasmus sounds to have been a jolly good scheme, but I think this Turing one sounds good too. I must say I'd never heard of Erasmus before, about 2 years ago. I'm all in favour of international exchanges. I went off as a 17-year-old to Kentucky for a year with an English-speaking union scholarship. The English-speaking union has lots of those sort of schemes still running, so I'd encourage youngsters to, if they feel up for that sort of thing, really to apply for these things. But I think there's a lot of sort of continuity politics going on in this discussion.
Right, Sonia, do you agree about that? Is it just about Brexit?
No, I think there are very real concerns when you look at the detail of the Turing scheme and how it's going to work, about whether it is going to actually provide these opportunities for young people. And the reason I say that is, you know, David's right that it provides slightly more, not lots more, in terms of living costs for British students who go abroad to study. But under Erasmus, there is an arrangement that when a student goes abroad, their tuition fees at that institution abroad are waived as part of the scheme. Now, Turing requires UK universities to sort of strike bilateral deals with European universities and universities elsewhere. And I think there's a danger, because of the increased cost of coming to study in the UK as a result of Brexit. It's expensive, you've got to pay for visa, the NHS charge, etc., that actually we see a reduction in places, which I think, you know, quite apart from the maintenance issue, would be really, really troubling because of the exchange of ideas that comes through these schemes.
Right, David, do you accept that as a potential difficulty with the Turing scheme, that it isn't reciprocal in the direct way that Erasmus was, and that you are going to have to rely on deals being struck with individual universities to waive their fees?
Well, we're expecting reciprocity. I mean, we've said that we will pay the tuition costs, and we expect the other institutions to do so, because that's the nature of international exchanges. So I accept that you've got to develop a new mechanism for achieving that, but there's no reason that we shouldn't receive that reciprocity. The fundamental thing for me, though, is that if it's a taxpayer-funded scheme, we need to see more disadvantaged young people getting their first experience of being abroad, rather than just the wealthiest getting their latest experience of being abroad.
Right, and Caroline,
can I just
yes, go on,
jump in there? Because absolutely no one would disagree with that, but there's so much that could have been done within the scope of Erasmus on that. And I do think absolutely there should be more support for disadvantaged students, but we've really got to look at this government's policy over the last 10 years. They've not been putting their money where their mouth is. When you look at the conversion of maintenance grants to loans, for example, loading more debt onto students from disadvantaged backgrounds, I just find it a bit rich, really. We've got to put it in the bigger context of provision for young people from working class backgrounds, include those who don't go to university, who get a tiny fraction of the funding that young people who go to university get. And government has done nothing over the last decade to address that gap in funding between the predominantly middle class young people who go to university and those who don't.
David?
Well, we've seen record numbers of disadvantaged young people go to university with those changes that Sonia's described. Where I do agree with her is that for decades, we've given more attention to those who go to university than the 50% plus of young people who don't. And the government is trying to now rectify that situation, because it does recognise that this has been neglected by governments of both parties for far too long.
Caroline, what about this idea of it being more global? Because Erasmus was obviously a European-based programme for UK students to benefit from. The idea of Turing is to be more global. Is that an advantage?
I just think let's build on what was good about Erasmus, and maybe you might want to extend that to certain parts of the world on top of it. But I just feel that the rhetoric that's surrounding this programme is, as you said earlier, in a sense, it's all about the kind of the signals of global Britain and less about what the actual experience is about. We live very close to the rest of the European continent, and we are part of it. And I think there is a particular purpose in trying to understand our neighbours so much better, to understand our mutual history so much better. I am all in favour, as David has said, about the importance of widening the access to these programmes to as many different people from as many backgrounds as possible, and particularly for more disadvantaged groups to be able to benefit from them. But I don't think we should be taken in by a whole load of rhetoric about global Britain and so forth, which probably is not going to be actually met by this programme. All
right, well, before we move on, I'm just going to show our viewers and explain to our panellists who can't see it directly. This is the advert, certainly being promoted heavily by Conservative Central Office, and it says, just launched, the Turing scheme is levelling up opportunities for students. But, Quentin, unfortunately, opportunities is misspelt. It actually says opportunities, I think, is how you pronounce it, because it's missing a rather vital I. So do you think there needs to be slightly more levelling up on spell checking at Conservative Central Office?
I think that's a classic. But I must say, I think a lot of this discussion may be in danger, dare I say, of becoming a little bit shishi. And I'm not sure that this is... Though it may be important to some people, it's going to shift many votes in places like Bolsover or even Herefordshire.
Right, well, forgive us for being shishi, even for a moment. And on that, let's move seamlessly onto your book, talking of shishi, which the title of which is Stop Bloody Bossing Me About. Everyone can see that. You said in the book, if we concentrate on the pandemic, that COVID-19 has put turbochargers on an authoritarianism that had been creeping up on us for a while. Now, Quentin, people will say, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Of course there are going to be controls and restrictions.
Yes, they will say that, but I think increasingly some people are thinking that these restrictions have served their purpose, and also that there is not just the restrictions themselves, there's the attitude with which these restrictions have been imposed. And undoubtedly, it's COVID-19, terribly a bad thing, horrible pandemic. But there's been a certain alacrity with which some of people have tried to take away our freedoms, and I think people have had enough of it. now, and I think that there is a sense that officialdom is turning into into martinets. And this isn't just about COVID. This book, it's a wider lament. It's a shriek against people wagging their fingers and say, "Thou must do this, thou shalt do this and that," to do with diet, to do with attitudes, to do with the way that you think, to do with the way that for instance, if you go to a National Trust house, you can't just have a slice of cake these days. You can't just enjoy the garden. You have to be told off about what you think about slavery and about gay rights and all sorts of liberal causes. And it's just becoming a bit wearisome. I think people have had enough of being told off the whole time.
Right. Well, in terms of being told off, Sonia, if we return to the original thought on COVID-19 just to start with, do you agree with Quentin?
Well, I'm not sure which National Trust properties Quentin's been visiting that he's been getting all these lectures, because I haven't had them when I visited. I disagree in the main, in the sense that I think these are special, extenuating circumstances around COVID. I think we're all grown up enough to live with the restrictions that we've seen imposed on us by government in order to curb the spread of this virus, in order to save lives. I don't think they're going to be sticking around after it's safe and the risks are much lower. No government wants to impose this level of restrictions. Where I do agree with Quentin, though, is I do think there are some areas where actually we haven't scrutinised some of the laws and the regulations and the powers enough. And I think particularly that is true around policing and policing of protests. So a really important democratic right is the freedom to associate, the freedom to protest. A court ruled last week we still have that right under human rights law. And I do think that the government's policing bill, actually, I think Quentin is right that in this area, the government's policing bill seeks to give more powers to the police to curb protests, which I think is really dangerous, takes us onto dangerous territory. It's something we've seen this last year with COVID regulations, and we saw the effects of that on Saturday with the completely overbearing, overhanded policing of the Sarah Everard vigil by the Met Police.
All right, and we may return to the issue of that policing bill. We've discussed it an awful lot this week, but in the context, as you say, Sonia, in terms of curbs or freedom being curbed. I just want to read you, David, this line from Quentin's book, which is masks were brought in as a psychological device, allegedly to reassure the COVID neurotics, but more to create a mood of public obedience. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree. Quentin's got a great gift for writing, but no, I don't agree with that sentiment. What I would say, which has been very interesting as a constituency MP, is that masks have probably been one of the most controversial topics that I've been written to about in this pandemic. I don't know if Caroline agrees, but these have divided opinion almost like nothing else. I mean, I think Quentin will have known the Prime Minister Boris Johnson for a lot longer than I think, given their time as journalists. And I think he would say that Boris Johnson is not someone who wants to take away people's freedoms. Where I do agree with him is where he referred to officialdom. And I do think at times officialdom can go too far. We saw that when we needed volunteers for vaccinations, and they were originally asking for people to do a course on de-radicalization before they could stick the needle in people's arms. But again, backing up my point about the PM, when he found out about that, they removed that requirement. So I do think there are times when we're bossed around too much, but I don't expect what we've seen in this pandemic to continue after June 21st.
Well, Quentin, do you agree with David on that? You were laughing at points during that.
Well, I was laughing about the requirement to undergo de-radicalisation if you're going to be helping at a jab centre. I think that was actually... Do you remember that terrible story about the crematorium in Northamptonshire where a funeral was being conducted and a man moved in close to give his his widowed mum, a hug, and someone of the crematorium staff shot up from the back of the creme and started telling them off and interrupted the funeral. And I'm afraid that there has been that sort of Jobsworthian figure who has been relishing this ability to boss us about. And that is what I'm trying to get into in this book, is that I think people are really heartily sick are being told off by people with clipboards. And it's not just about COVID, this. If you go to Swindon railway station and you descend the stairs on platform 1,
yes,
an automated voice cuts in and tells you to use the handrail. Now, I don't need that. I'm 58 years old. I've got to the age of 58 without falling downstairs so far. It may yet start, but for different reasons. But just please stop treating us like kids.
Right.
We are adults, most of us, and we want to be treated thus.
Right. Are there jobs worth in Brighton, Caroline?
Well, I was going to say that I've had far more people writing to me about the draconian levels in the new policing bill than I ever have about masks. So I think there's a difference between Brighton and David's constituency. But I think with Quentin, you know, he's doing his typical thing. He actually has a kernel of a very serious point here, but then he sort of takes it ad absurdum. So then we all sort of laugh. But you know, when it comes to the coronavirus Act, for example, I didn't vote for it to be renewed last September because I do think we ought to have far greater parliamentary scrutiny over some of the measures inside it, because there are some quite extraordinary measures that, for example, under the Act, police and immigration officials can detain anyone they think is, and I quote, potentially infectious, which is a definition that is so broad as to be meaningless. You know, the Act contains some incredibly draconian powers, and yes, they may well be necessary, and some of them are necessary, but so is parliamentary scrutiny of them, all the more so for that reason. And so I do think that the government should be looking again at some of the things in the Act when they bring it back, I think, next week to be renewed, to make sure that there is greater scrutiny of it, there is greater accountability, and we can look at some of the measures, for example, that allow social care to be suspended and so forth.
Right. Well, David earlier said that actually Boris Johnson is naturally a libertarian. He certainly sees himself that way. Wouldn't actually Quentin be that comfortable with some of the measures? Naturally, we're in the middle of a pandemic. But let's just show you this from an early press conference. In fact, it was the day before I think lockdown actually came in the first time last March. Here's Boris Johnson at the press conference.
Prime Minister, people aren't acting responsibly, so when are you going to get tougher and bring in the police? And Mr.
Bring in the police?
Yes.
Right.
You've talked about curfews, so could you talk about what the police could do and when?
Right, well, he sounds shocked there, Quentin, the idea of bringing in the police.
Yeah, I think actually he was just having difficulty hearing that day. But,
Quentin, you've just ruined that part of the programme. We're going to assume that he could hear. He was just expressing surprise.
Okay, sorry about that. I think he may have had libertarian instincts, but they have been difficult to spot recently. And the way that protesters have been lifted into police vans for daring to voice doubts about the recent government behaviour outside Westminster has been an example of how certainly the forces of law and order have not been channeling Boris's so-called libertarianism. People change when they get into power. And his need now is to stay in power. So maybe his libertarianism has been shaded a bit.
Right. Has he forgotten his libertarianism, David?
No, I don't think he has. We've seen similar restrictions imposed in every country in the world. And for a long time, we were being told that we ought to be following the example of Sweden instead. And then Sweden had to change courses as well. So, look, I don't like the restrictions any more than anybody else does. And I'm keen to see them gone as soon as possible. But when we remove them, we have to know we really have got through this pandemic and that we're not going to be having the stop-start situation we've had previously, which is really difficult for particularly small businesses.
We have pictures. We can't show them to you just at the moment, but they're of Sefton Park in Liverpool, where you can see crowds of people gathering, Sonia. Do you think people have got to the stage where they're beginning to think lockdown is already over?
I think there's a sort of, I think there's a positive feeling in the country, which is totally understandable. The vaccine rollout is going well. Lots of people are now in a position where, their older mums and dads or grandparents may have been vaccinated. So I think it's because I do really buy what the government says, how important it is that we stick by the rules. It would be a really difficult situation if we have lots of mixing between vaccinated and unvaccinated people, because that's when you might see vaccine resistant strains potentially developing here in the UK. So I think there's it's good that there's extra emphasis in the government messaging. It's going well, the vaccine rollout, but you still need to stick to the rules. That said, I think a much bigger issue than people not sticking to the rules is actually the lack of sick pay, for example, the lack of financial means for people who need to self-isolate, that the government hasn't tackled.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of our guests. And of course, I will be back at 12:15 on Monday. And as we said earlier, the Prime Minister has a press conference later on. Bye-bye.